Welcome back to another episode. And tonight we're going to be covering two main themes. The first is this is going to be the last time that I'm going to lecture about legitimation crisis. And so, with that parting of ways, I'm going to give some parting thoughts. These are just some of my own personal takeaways after reading Legitimation Crisis. And the second objective is just introducing the new, I guess you could say the new series, if it comes to that, which is going to focus on the Foucault-Habermas debate. And so my objective there is just going to be to describe what that is in general terms, but hopefully terms that are specific enough to arouse some interest in the substance of what that debate actually amounts to. So, to begin with the first item, here are some of my parting thoughts. And what I did was I wrote them down. I wrote down what I think is kind of the essence of them. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about them. So number one is the theme of a residuum of individuality that maintains itself versus an instrumentalist, functionalist social paradigm. So what I have in mind there is, if you think about the kind of situation that might hold in a totalitarian regime or an authoritarian regime, what sociologists have noticed is that there is something within the individual that tends to resist, that tends to hold out against those attempts at totalizing the sort of top-down domination that you find in those societies. In those kind of societies or social organizations where there's an attempt to try to breed a certain amount of conformity, uniformity in patterns of behavior, patterns of speech, even patterns of thought, in order to perhaps maximize the amount of action potential of the society, to use some sociological verbiage. So the idea there is that even in the face of situations where people have been in a position where they've had to try to maintain themselves in the face of that sort of top-down domination, history has shown that there is what you might call a residuum that tends to resist those attempts at control and domination. There is this residuum that you might call the individuality of the individual that maintains itself even in situations like in Eastern Europe, where you had 20, 30 years of people living behind the Iron Curtain who were subject to these kinds of attempts to regulate and produce a certain kind of uniformity. That there is this something in individuals that resists those attempts. And that's actually a very important part of sociological theory that I don't think is discussed quite enough. In terms of psychology, in terms of psychoanalysis, there is, as part of our maturity, something called individuation, which seems to be something that each of us as individual human beings are challenged to do. Individuation is the realization of yourself as an individual in the face of an other. So that idea of being an individual comes into being with the realization of an other, and the realization of that other, which is probably apparent early on in early childhood, is something that helps you take yourself in turn as an object and learn how to understand yourself over time. And the whole project of maturity is, in a sense, a project of individuation, in the sense that you are learning your place in the world, and to become comfortable with it, retain a sense of your own individuality, not to be swallowed up by the world, and at the same time understand the world as another and form a kind of harmonious understanding of how you relate to the world as the ultimate project of maturity. So that drive toward individuation, toward realizing yourself as an individual, is one of the more fundamental parts of our psychology. So to live in a political regime or in a work situation, or any kind of work situation where you feel your individuality threatened, in a sense of trying to maintain a kind of uniformity of behavior or uniformity of action, something that tries to infringe upon that individuality may at a certain point become something that you feel is actually threatened, is actually a threat to your sense of yourself. And that's something that we all deal with to one extent or another when it comes to playing a role in a society or in an organization. When you get a new job, there are new rules, there are new standards that you have to conform to. There are interactions with coworkers, and these are all, in a sense, limiting conditions. These are all, in a sense, certain boundaries. And as you try to fit in with this matrix of different expectations, there is going to be a sense in which your individuality is limited to a certain extent, so that you can't just act out in any way that you want. And so in any sort of situation where you have to play a role within a social system, there is going to be a certain extent to which you might feel your individuality threatened. However, that is one of the challenges of life, is to negotiate between those boundaries and asserting your individuality, figuring out exactly how to do that, to come out on the other side with a strong sense of yourself as an individual. But even in those situations, in totalitarian regimes, where it seems like the entire effort of the society is to produce a uniformity of thought and action, it comes out as a historical reality that individuals tend to maintain their individuality even in those cases. And if you want to relate that idea to legitimation crisis, that residuum of individuality is the thing that ultimately will provide the foundation for social change. So in a social situation where the organization is such that it's meant to function in a certain way, and the individuals within that social system are playing roles so that the goals of the society can be achieved, under certain circumstances where that system begins to break down, individuals will retain their individuality. They will retain some sense of themselves enough to think outside of the constraints of that system. And at that point, the legitimacy of the system comes into question. And I think there is something to be said here for the resiliency of the human spirit, even through long years of being made to fit in within a certain social role. Individuals maintain their sense of individuality, and it's that core of individuality that ultimately becomes the foundation for social change and for societies to evolve. Okay, so that's my first takeaway. Now, some thoughts about Marx. A couple of episodes back, I was saying that there are some problems with Marxist theory, and the main one that I've touched on a few times is this issue about the labor theory of value as leading directly to the idea that the only way to realize profit within a capitalist system is through the exploitation of labor. And that for Marx, this is actually something that's considered to be inevitable. So as capitalism develops, according to Marx, we get closer and closer to monopoly conditions. And if the economy isn't managed well enough by the political regime, eventually you are going to have a crisis. We're going to reach a point where there's just a monopoly of capital, all of the wealth goes to the bourgeoisie, and the proletariat is disenfranchised by machines that have replaced them. This is Marx's Armageddon scenario for late capitalism. And he thinks that this scenario is inevitable. And it's under those conditions that the revolution will take place that's going to be the next stage, that is going to be the stepping stone for stepping into the last phase of history, which he says is a communist social system, a communist regime. And one of the points that I brought up about this is that modern economists will tell you that there's certainly more than one way to make profit. Not only that, but the exploitation of labor is not something that necessarily has to be done in order for businesses to realize a certain degree of profit. In fact, there are a lot of good things that can come from paying your employees a decent wage. Historically speaking, there are a few instances, some of them are quite famous, of employers who realized that they needed to expand the economic base within a society in order to create a more available base of consumption for the product they're selling. And the most famous one is the example of Henry Ford, who decided to raise the wages of his laborers in the Ford assembly factory so that his laborers could become consumers of the product that he was selling. And he was very successful in having done that. Very recently, there was a program that was started by Bank of America to give $1 billion in funds that's aimed specifically at low-income communities, specifically African-American communities, where it looks like their intention is to try to do something to develop very hard-hit economic areas I haven't looked into all the details, but it looks like this is what their intention is, seemingly, apparently, to try to develop more of an economic base for their business. So there certainly is a rationale that you can bring to the table in terms of, well, when capitalists go out and they want to make more profit, there are other ways besides exploiting your workers in order to realize greater profits. And certainly things like marketing, advertising, all of these modern techniques. And I haven't mentioned this before, but certainly the stock market plays a huge role in this. And in fact, if there is one aspect of the modern capitalist economy that begins to look like it has economic forces in it that kind of resemble what Marx had in mind that might lead to revolutionary conditions, it's just that when you talk about corporations, it seems like their beholdenness to shareholders ends up making profit an end in itself, almost to the extent where profit supersedes any other consideration. So I've encountered situations like this with family members. Somebody I know was working for a tech company that underwent some pretty radical shifts in their culture as soon as a certain style of management was embraced that allowed them to survive some difficult times. But that led to a change in their culture toward more of a profit-oriented business model. And when you have that kind of business model, suddenly it does open the door for things like layoffs, even when they might not be absolutely necessary. Layoffs, to employees who might be doing very valuable things for the company, but from the standpoint of profit and from the standpoint of the insistence that profit be made on a quarterly basis in order to realize a certain standing in the stock market, those things tend to go by the wayside. Okay, so that's not everything I wanted to say about Marx, but I am kind of repeating points that I've made in the past. But the question came up of what is actually left of Marx once you take out the idea that this communist revolution is just inevitable. And I think, on the one hand, the idea of merging Marxism with humanism makes a lot of sense. And I mentioned that that was a direction that the Frankfurt School took with people like Habermas, with people like Horkheimer and Adorno. Their version of Marxism is one that's supposed to be one that has liberating potential for the human being. So there is this aspect of Marx that wants to embrace the humanity of individuals in the face of a functionalist kind of way of looking at business organizations. Functionalist in the sense that we're going to look at a business as a system that is recognized by the people who've founded it, instituted it, created it, as having certain goals. And if that goal is profit, in that scenario, which is the actual scenario for a lot of corporate situations out there, then there's a potential for dehumanization with greater and greater attempts to move toward profitability and efficiency. And what Horkheimer and Adorno and the Frankfurt School want to try to bring out of their version of Marxism is that idea of labor itself as being something that should have within it a potential for the liberation of the individual instead of the dehumanization of the individual. So work can be dehumanizing, but we could also maybe imagine situations where work could also be liberating, where it could also allow us to develop more fully as human beings instead of limiting who we are as human beings. And that's the aspect of Marx that they want to bring out. Now, that's a very nice idea, but one of the potential problems with it is that in the actual history of countries that have tried to institute a communist form of a communist economy, anything other than a capitalist economy, the economy ends up not doing as well. And one of the problems is in an economy that isn't doing well, you have limited opportunities. One of the tragedies of the reality of life behind the Iron Curtain and in the Soviet Union, in countries like Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and in Russia, there were a lot of very intelligent, very bright people who could have done a lot of great things for their society if they had been given the opportunity. And the fact is that the economy just simply didn't allow people enough opportunities to actually do those things. So Soviet Russia and the environment behind the Iron Curtain was one that emphasized heavy industrialization, lots of agricultural labor, and for a few people who were committed to communist ideology, the chance to be a member of the intelligentsia. It's interesting that during those years, there were three social classes that you could belong to. One was the peasant class, two was the industrial labor class, and number three was a member of the intelligentsia. But because the economy was not expansive, perhaps it was even contracting for many, many years, the economy did not allow an opportunity for a large number of very bright, very capable people to go out and make the most of their lives. And this is in a Marxist system that is meant to be one that liberates the proletariat from the bourgeoisie. And an ironic twist of history, when you look at the recent history of China, as I suppose most people are aware, they shifted from a purely Marxist economy to a capitalist economy and immediately began to grow. So I think it's something that has to be taken into consideration. On the one hand, you have the theory behind Marxism, and on the other hand, you have the practice. On the one hand, you have problems with capitalism, work that's dehumanizing. On the other hand, you have economic systems that simply didn't allow any opportunity. So I'm going to move on to a third point. I have a few more, but I want to have time to discuss Foucault versus Habermas. So my third one has to do with postmodernity. And I wrote this down as the desublimization of the functionalist aspirations of modernity as a way to characterize postmodernity. And let me just say what I mean there by desublimation. What I'm after there is kind of borrowing an idea from psychoanalysis, where the idea would be you have these primitive drives. Maybe they're aggressive drives. Maybe you have drives to fight and express your aggressive side physically. But instead, that becomes sublimated. Those urges, drives, become sublimated through the activity of sports. And there's a kind of way in which our basic drives, in some cases our erotic drives, can be sublimated into things that are recognized as being very lofty and very very, very good activities. They gain a certain amount of social prestige through the sublimating of those basic drives. There's a kind of eroticism people sometimes talk about in connection with some of the imagery that comes out of the Renaissance, ways of representing the ecstatic states of saints and that sort of thing when they come into contact with the divine. So that's a way of sublimating a basic drive, taking a basic drive that might have the potential to undermine social cohesion and turning it into something that is either not harmful or has the potential to be socially beneficial, maybe even elevate the human spirit in some sense. So I'm talking here about the desublimation of the functionalist aspirations of modernity. And what I mean there is just simply there's been a way in which within our capitalist society that we put a certain amount of value, we attach a certain level of prestige to going out and making lots of money, attaining a certain social status, doing all those things as ways of being part of the functional system of capitalism itself. So there's a way in which an individual can fill a certain role, taking all of those basic drives, taking the sort of drives that might go into pushing their sense of who they are as an individual into certain directions that are more socially beneficial. And there's a way in which we as a society have, to a certain extent, kind of placed a certain level of idealization on achieving a certain status in society where you fit that role. Okay? And what I have in mind is that one aspect of postmodernity, and maybe even a very important or maybe a core idea of postmodernity, maybe what defines postmodernity, I'm not sure, is the idea that being a part of this social whole has some larger significance, that you can connect it to some larger, bigger ideas. Now, that was easy to do in a feudal system, given the worldview of people in the Middle Ages or even in the Renaissance. So you can connect your place in society, your sense in the social order, to a larger sense of the harmony of society and even taking that up to the heavens. This is one of the kind of commonplaces of the medieval mind that you can see reflected in medieval churches. It's this idea that we as individuals have our place in this greater order of the cosmos. So our lives derive even kind of a metaphysical significance as a result of our understanding of not just being, an insignificant part of an order, but of playing a role within a larger divine context. But in modern society, that sense of context, that sense of being able to tie your sense of what you're doing and the meaning of your life to something bigger than yourself, is something that's gotten lost. So, in the sense of desublimating that idea, the sense that I'm after there is just simply that the scales kind of fall away. That larger sense of being able to connect with some larger meaning that you can really attribute to the role that you play in society is something that becomes more and more questioned, and you start to see yourself more and more as just kind of serving your own local interests, maybe being a person who's important for your family, maybe having an important role to play in the organization that you're part of. But in a lot of cases, maybe people end up feeling like they are kind of just a cog in the machine. So one of the challenges that Habermas brings up to a certain extent, and that sociologists have discussed, is to try to find ways to bring individuals into those roles so that they feel like they're doing something significant, that they belong there, that their place in the order of things, the work that they do, has some significance. Because unless a society is able to do that, ultimately there's going to be a breakdown in basic motivation. This is something that Habermas discusses a little bit, but I think it's been a little bit underserved in the discussion so far.